Welcome back, guys, and welcome to another Porsche comparison. Today we'll be comparing a 718 Cayman GTS 4.0 versus a 991.2 generation Carrera T. Both of these cars are priced similarly on the market today, right around $100,000. You might be able to find some examples for just under 100 grand. I've maintained over the last couple of years of reviewing various 718 GTS 4.0 models that this is probably still the best, most well-rounded sports car you can buy for right around 100 grand. If your use case is mostly street driving with the occasional canyon run and maybe a track day sprinkled in here and there, this is one of the best, highest quality, most reliable, best built, best handling sports cars as long as you don't need more than 2 seats. But does that mean that you can't make a 911 feel just as good? The Cayman GTS 4.0 obviously is mid-engined, naturally aspirated. We have a 6-speed manual transmission. This car makes 394 horsepower and 309 pound-feet of torque from its 4-liter engine. Revs to almost 8,000 RPM, but we are limited with the Cayman platform with strut front and rear suspension. Not quite the case with that 991.2 Carrera T, which has strut front but multi-link rear. However, based on other examples of these cars that I've driven, I've always maintained that the 991.2 doesn't have that same amazing turn-in and sharp handling of these lesser Cayman models. But does that change when you option rear axle steering on the 991.2 and make some minor suspension adjustments like alignment and springs and a DSC controller, which is exactly what Eric, the owner, has done to that car. Keenan, the owner of this GTS 4.0, has pretty much kept it stock. He's added a weighted shift knob and some sole over axle pipes to open up the sound a bit. So with that, let's take this GTS 4.0 for a drive first and then see if a lightly modified Carrera T from the 991.2 gen can be just as fun to drive. Drive mode selector into Sport Plus. With the sole over axle pipe, the induction note of this 4-liter engine is something to behold. It might not sound as exotic as a flat plane crank V8, but listen to this, guys. So good. It's just a satisfying sound. We're rev matching our own downshifts right now, although this does have auto rev match if you want it. Very long gearing with this 6-speed manual. A complaint I've made in so many Cayman videos, but I'll do it again. I'll do it every single time until Porsche gives this a shorter second gear from the factory. We can't really even get out of second gear here, but the mid-engine balance of this platform is just phenomenal. As I over-rev that downshift in Sport Plus, the throttle is a little touchy. Just the turn-in of this car in completely stock form. It's just a car that feels so natural. Turn in, so little understeer, zero understeer at canyon speeds, truly. And while it's not an oversteer monster, you can still use the throttle to fine-tune your line. It's a car you can definitely throttle steer, even at canyon speeds. Not doing big slides, but again, just increasing the precision with which you can point the front end of this car. The stock brakes, they're more than adequate. This car only weighs around 3,200 pounds. This car just loves the tight hairpins. And it's got plenty of traction. This is what I love about the Cayman, especially the 718 GTS 4.0. It's truly the most well-rounded sports car you can buy. Or is it? Is that Carrera T even better. We'll have to see because it has a turbocharged engine mounted behind the rear axle. Let's turn off the PASM dampers now, which should make this car a little more compliant. Gearing though, it is a bummer. Look at this balance. Beautiful. Just beautiful. And you can get so hard on the brakes. No fade. Great pedal feel. The throttle response is fantastic. The steering, the CPS rag, not a ton of feedback, but it's just the right ratio, the quickness. Not too quick, not too slow. Excellent weighting. It's just a very natural car to drive in every single way. I will never tire of this car. While it's not a car I personally would spend my own money on, that's not because I don't love it, it's because it just doesn't fit my use case. If I'm going to be spending this much money on a two-seater mid-engine sports car, or two-seater sports car of any kind, it either has to be something that is a true occasion to drive every time I get behind the wheel. That's why I still have my original NSX. Or it has to be a track weapon. This car is neither. Again, this is the jack of all trades Porsche. As long as you don't need more than 2 seats, this car can do it all. And sound fantastic while doing it. Such a delicious powertrain, and even though the gearing of this manual is too long for my liking, I'm just thankful this car was offered with a manual, and a very good one at that. Let's hop into a lightly modified 991.2 Carrera T and see if your roughly $100,000 would be better spent on the rear engine turbocharged Porsche. Alright, we're now in the 2018 Porsche 911 991.2 generation Carrera T. The T is meant to be a slightly more stripped down, more driver-focused version of the base 911. It has the same 3-liter turbocharged flat-six engine. When stock, it made 370 horsepower, 331 pound-feet of torque, but the owner, Eric, has put an Evo MS tune on this, so it should be making closer to 450 horsepower. That's the beauty of having a turbocharged engine. This car also weighs around 3,200 pounds, strut front multi-link rear suspension, so a more sophisticated suspension geometry at the rear compared to the 718. And the T includes quite a few things as standard. Porsche Active Suspension Management or PASM, Porsche Sports Exhaust with black tips, a shorter 3.59 final drive, Porsche Torque Vectoring with LSD, which is something the GTS 4.0 also had, and we get Sport Chrono with dynamic engine mounts and a drive mode selector on the steering wheel, same as what that 718 had. This also comes with 20-inch Carrera S wheels as standard, and as part of the T trim we get lightweight glass and reduced sound deadening. There are some mods on this, as I mentioned: DSC Sport Controller, H&R springs, GT3 front sway bar, camber plates, and exhaust. Rear axle steering is an option on this car. This one thankfully has it. So let's see if a few mods plus the rear axle steer option can make this Carrera T handle as well as that brilliant GTS 4.0. We'll put it into Sport Plus, PASM in the stiffer setting, Porsche Sports Exhaust on. Interior impressions, I do think the Carrera T does feel a little bit higher quality. I prefer the overall look and feel. Let's talk about how these two cars drive. That's a lot more shovel, right? Not nearly as much sound. Muffled by the turbos here. But this engine still revs to over 7,000 RPM. And it pulls all the way to the top. You know what? I can barely tell this car is rear engine right now. The handling balance is really good. It's very sharp at the front. It's still not as willing to turn in as that Cayman, but this is very close, much closer than I expected. I still do get a little bit of that pendulum feeling. Coming out of corners, when I apply aggressive throttle, I do feel that front end get a little light. A classic 911 trait, but it's pretty subtle here, I would say. Electric power steering rack, same as the Cayman. Similarly, lacking feedback, but also incredibly precise. Now this suspension setup, just lowering springs and a DSC controller, if anything, I think the rear end of this car feels a little bit more unsettled compared to that Cayman. I'm not sure why that is. There is a little bit of turbo lag below 3,000 RPM. It's not nearly as linear as that 4-liter engine. But as far as turbocharged engines go, this is one of the more responsive ones. Look at that turn-in. These are low-speed corners, but this car feels very natural to drive. The rear axle steering, combined with some front camber, really do wonders for the 911. Excellent brakes. They feel just as good as those in the GTS 4.0. But the suspension, slightly more unsettled. It's mostly at the rear. I feel like there's just a little bit more vertical motion when going over bumps. Not bad by any means. I just think the stock GTS 4.0 suspension might feel a little bit more planted, which is very surprising considering its strut front and rear, whereas this has a more advanced multi-link rear. Maybe that comes down to these mods. Very likely could be. After all, we're on the stock PASM dampers, but with H&R lowering springs. Unfortunate that we couldn't get a completely stock example to compare. The nice part of having these mods on this car is we can really see whether a few basic mods can bring the 911's handling up to par at canyon speeds with the Caymans. The straight line performance though, it's no joke. With a tune and an exhaust, this car feels so much more accelerative than a stock GTS 4.0. I do miss that naturally aspirated howl though. This one sounds good, but definitely you can tell it's muffled and it doesn't rev as high. Makes me wonder why Porsche never gave the 991.2 generation that same 4-liter engine. That would have been great. Don't give it the GT3 suspension and brakes and all that. Leave it at a Carrera or Carrera S level in terms of the chassis, but give it that naturally aspirated 4-liter. That would have been an amazing car. Honestly, I'm really impressed by the handling of this 991.2T. I think the rear axle steering really does make a huge difference. One more straight line pull. Long gearing as well here, but I feel like this engine makes use of it a little bit better because it's more powerful, because it has more torque. That being said, again, this is tuned. A stock Carrera T technically makes a little less power than the GTS 4.0. All right, conclusion time. For your roughly $100,000, which car is more enjoyable to drive? This is a really tough one because as much as I love the naturally aspirated engine and the sharp handling, mid-engine balance of that 718, this 911 in terms of handling gets really close. And the engine, although not as responsive, it does make a ton of power. Power is fun. So which one would I have? Honestly, I think it would come down to use case. If I'm tracking the car, I might just go with the GTS 4.0, although I mentioned earlier, personally, I'd rather just go for a GT4 at that point. But I think the inherent mid-engine balance and that responsive high-revving engine just speak to me more as something to be enjoyed on a racetrack. This Carrera T, though, I would take as a daily driver all day long. You do get the slight increase in practicality. You can see Eric's baby seat in the back here, and I think it's just a slightly more upscale feel. But it's good knowing that with the right options and the right mods, you can bridge the gap in handling between a 911 and a Cayman. So a big shout out to Keenan and Eric, the owners of these two amazing cars. Let me know how you think they compare. Which would you spend your money on? Are there other mods for the 991.2 that improve the handling even more? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next one.